The threshold of a new millennium is an ideal point to review the recent past of Sunderland and examine what effect the last 100 years has had on its citizens. Who could have imagined, as the people of Sunderland prepared to celebrate the dawn of the 20th century, the momentous changes about to occur in industry, education and housing through to sport and entertainment? We reflect on these events with the help of people who experience them personally and who share with us a century of and tragedy, war and peace, hardships and good times. At the beginning of the 20th century, Sunderland had already made its name as one of the greatest centres of shipbuilding in the world. In the middle of the 19th century, Sunderland was producing a quarter of the total world tonnage. In 1906, the total number of people employed in Weir shipyards was nearly 13,000, out of an adult male population of almost 40,000. The industry was in optimistic mood, as new technology allowed for the building of ever larger ships. Between 1900 and 1909, 729 ships were launched from the Weir. Shipyards stretched all along the riverbank. The names of Doxford and Sons, Deptford Shipyard, Thompson's, Bartram and Sons, Pickersgill and Sons and Austin's, among many others, became synonymous with Sunderland. Average wages were just over £2 a week, a higher wage than Clydeside workers, with platers receiving the best pay. Sunderland shipbuilders were renowned for their skill and hard work, but like many other industries, were at the mercy of periodic depressions, when boom in times of demand, such as the war years, gave way to lean times when overseas competitors, the price of raw materials and overcapacity were on the increase. During the First World War, new yards had to be opened to meet demand. But by 1921, the effects of the Depression were being felt. Smaller yards began to close and unemployment soared. In 1926, half the shipyard labour force were out of work, and in 1930, shipbuilding virtually came to a halt. However, hope still flickered. Technical developments continued, and Doxfords perfected their diesel marine engine in 1926. It was in this shipyard, in 1936, that Tom Corner began his working life at the age of 14.
Leaving school at Christmas, I was thinking, well, what would I do? Where do I work? But we used to stand on the Alexander Bridge as boys and look down on Doxford shipyard, and you would see your grandfather working, your father, your uncles. The noise at 7:30 when the buzzer blew was terrific. And everything was done by hand. Hand tools. Some of the hand tools was made by the men in the shop. They used to make their own tools. There was no presses like we have now for pressing steel out. So we had to put up with the noise. So I'd walk through the shipyard and I'd see the conditions the men were working in. No protective clothing. For the apron was a sack. Even for the gloves were made out of a bit sacking. And they were walking in slush and water. No overhead cover. And they were handling plates of steel. Man-handling those steel plates into a punching machine to punch the rivet holes in. And that first morning, 8:15 on a Monday morning, I want to go to the toilet. I found my way down to the shipyard. Down a few steps, there's a little office. There's a man sitting there with a wooden leg. And I believe his name was Mr. Pemberton. He opened his little window, gave me a piece of paper about 6 inches square. Don't be long, boy. So, long I went in. Well, no cubicles, a long steel trough, probably about 25 to 30 feet long, and a wood ridge along the front edge. And the men were sitting there, and I said, well, I found a space between two men, and they were going, push along, boy, push along, you know. And they were smoking the pipes. Then I felt a sudden gush of water underneath me. And this was caused by the man in the office. Every few minutes he would turn on the stopcock, which had a big heavy wheel, and he'd turn it on, and he could control the amount of water coming along. Of course, he turned it on full, and it gushed up, and I jumped off there. And I never entered that place again. Never.
Long overdue government subsidies and the advent of the Second World War resurrected Sunderland shipbuilding. Despite some closures and amalgamations, there were 20,000 workers employed in local shipyards in 1964. But by 1986, that workforce had shrunk to 1/10. Although further efforts were made, including nationalisation, credit schemes, EEC support and Save the Shipyards campaign, eventually shipbuilding on the Wear ceased altogether in the early 1990s. An unthinkable turn of events to most Sunderland folk, one which reflected the nation's decline in world shipping, but one which most people wished could have been avoided. It was the discovery of coal in this area which really led to Sunderland's later development. Yet, like shipbuilding, it has now disappeared from the city. In 1914, the only pit within the boundaries of the borough was Monk Wearmouth, later to be called Wearmouth Colliery. It had taken 9 years to sink the shaft as the coal lay under limestone and sand. When it began shipping coal in 1835, it was the deepest mine in the world. In 1900, Wearmouth Coal Company opened Hilton Colliery, which lay within the Sunderland Rural District Council boundaries, as did Ryup and Silksworth collieries. The coal industry in Sunderland, although still subject to supply and demand, did not follow so much the ups and downs experienced by shipbuilding in the Depression years. This was because most of Sunderland's coal was destined for London, where it was consistently needed for domestic use and for producing gas. The shipping of this coal kept the docks and quays alive too. At their peak in the late 1920s, the Port of Sunderland's coal shipments reached almost 5.5 million tons. Coal mining continued to thrive for decades. In 1960, it employed 18,000 workers. However, by the 1980s, only Wearmouth Colliery remained, employing only 2,000. It was one of the most advanced collieries in the country and scheduled for considerable capital investment. But it was not to be.
I started the mines when I was 14, and then I went down the pit at 15 and a half, and started to work with ponies. And I worked with ponies up till I was 23. It was that hot, you know, you just had a little pair of shorts, your hat, and you had a cloth cap with a tin front with your lamp in. It was red hot, so you were sweating all the time. It was the ventilation wasn't that good then. It improved as the technology improved, and we were quite. We had travelling time of 87 minutes travelling time one way in and 87 minutes out. So you can think in an 8-hour shift what you were working, but it was continuous work. Well, when you eventually got on to piecework, everything had to be negotiated, you know. You didn't get your wages, they didn't come in like that. Everything had to be worked and fought by the union and the men themselves. For instance, if you were coal-hewing and you had 1 6pence a ton and you couldn't, what we call, make ourselves out, that's make a wage, you had to negotiate with the management, which took weeks. Now, in the meantime, you drop your tonnages down, you didn't fill as many tubs, what we went on the knock. So you went on the knock for so many weeks, then you negotiate with the management to get the price lifted up so you could get more wages. So there's nothing ever was achieved in the mines without a fight.
The coal trade was a tremendous trade in those days. People just do not believe nowadays what coal was all about. We served every industry you can imagine. It wasn't just coal for electric power stations and gas works, it was for blacksmiths, coke ovens, it was for bunkers. That was a major part of our trade. In fact, we sent coal all over the world so that they had stockpiles of coal for ships, because in those days the majority of ships were steamships. By the 70s things were changing quite somewhat. There wasn't the coal needed for different industries. The gas industry, for example, was fading away. The North Sea gas was coming in and they didn't want to be bothered making gas anymore. So that was a big reduction, because certain pits were known as gas collieries. Weymouth, for example, their coal was ideal for making gas. So it gradually got down, and with the increase in mechanical mining, the coal was getting different, and we finished up really, all we were doing was supplying coal for power stations, which went on, of course, until, well, in 1986, I believe, was about the end of it in Sunderland. I was still on the docks in those days, and that was really the end of the coal trade as far as Sunderland was concerned.
Although to a lesser degree than shipbuilding and mining, Sunderland has been home to several other industries, employing women as well as men, such as Vaux's Brewery, Bryden Fibres rope makers, Plessey Telecommunications, and Coles, later Grove Machines. All of these plants have now closed, and the majority of job opportunities now present themselves in the service industries. However, glassmaking continues at Newell's, previously Corning's Glassworks. It's sad that Sunderland, which had so much to offer in terms of skills and effort, has become known at various times this century as a centre of high unemployment. Relying as it did upon the heavy industries which had been so dependable in the Victorian era, it became one of the worst hit areas in the Depression era. The census of 1931 shows total male unemployment standing at 36.6%. Poverty amongst unemployed industrial workers had a knock-on effect on the retail trade in some parts of Sunderland too. People simply could not buy anything but the most basic necessities. By 1933, over half the working population was unemployed. Many labouring men were involved in public work schemes, such as building Roker Promenade. However, some people saw little hope of new industry coming to Sunderland and recommended migration as the best solution. Yet, the economic problems of other parts of Britain soon made this an impractical move. Many girls went into service in the south, but many found it to be an alien environment and soon returned home. The Depression is remembered by many as a time of hardship, struggle, and lost opportunities, as a job, however badly paid, was favoured above education. It's also associated with the introduction of the means test, the memory of which retains a sense of bitterness and humiliation for many people. In 1931, a man and wife with 2 children received £1 7 shillings and threepence, or £1.36 dole. However, If a child under 20 was working, everything over 12 and sixpence earned by a son or 10 and ninepence by a daughter was deducted from the father's dole. Kind relatives who had not fallen on hard times were sometimes all that kept the unemployed from subsistence point. As heavy industry declined, the new service or consumer industries grew. The retail trade on the whole thrived. People in work were buying furnishings for their houses, washing machines, radios and cars. In 1934 you could buy a Morris 8 for £118 at Turvey's or an Austin 7 for £100 at Binns Motor Stores in Homeside. Low inflation made things easier for those in work. Cheap luxuries were within reach of almost everyone in work at Woolworths, Boots and other shops. Sunderland had a variety of department stores too, including Binns, Jopling's and Blackett's, of which Jopling's is still a thriving business. There were also many smaller businesses. The arcade of shops known as Palmer's Arcade was a great favourite with children, as was White's Market, an indoor market affectionately called Jackie White's in the town. After the Second World War, White's Market occupied a dramatic position at one end of a bomb site, on which barrow boys used to sell their wares. Through the 90s and early 60s, the surviving family businesses made shopping in Sunderland colourful and lively. Joseph's Toy Shop, Maynard's Sweet Shop, Milburn's Bakers and Confectioners, the many small dress shops and haberdashers, to name but a few. Saturday was the traditional day for shopping in town, and people travelled from small towns and villages, particularly south and west of the town, to join the bustle, which was always at its most bustling on a Saturday afternoon. For many women and girls, it was an occasion to dress in your best. A great treat would be to visit the Winter Gardens, before it was bombed in the Second World War, with its exotic plants, bright goldfish, its warm temperature and sense of warmer climes. Or perhaps lunch in a restaurant, Meng's maybe, the Palatine or Binns, where the supervisor glided elegantly between the tables to show you to your seat. Like the retail trade, the entertainment industry also prospered, despite the town's economic problems. The first regular moving pictures were shown in the Victoria Hall in 1901, and by 1915 there were over 20 picture houses in Sunderland. In the mid-1930s, 5 new cinemas opened, including the Regal and the Ritz. Even the Empire Theatre, a very popular theatre with a huge staff and frequently played by Vesta Tilley, was converted into a cinema between 1931 and 1933. The Regal's prices, ranging from 2 shillings or 10p down to 7pence or 3p, were too expensive for the unemployed, but the Corra charged only 2pence or 3pence. Saturday morning children's shows were extremely popular.
The cinemas were in the heyday, they really were. And I can remember the first film that we showed was called Jungle Book. Very popular at the time with the kids, and it ran for a fortnight. Every house was a sellout, and the queues were right round the building, right down the back lane. It was a really thriving thing.
During the 1960s, cinemas like the Odeon, formerly the Regal, fulfilled a dual role as they became the venue for pop concerts. The Rolling Stones played the Odeon in the mid-60s. In the 1930s and 40s, dancing, usually to live bands, was another popular activity at dance halls like the Rink, Wetherall's and the Seaburn Hotel.
So we used to go to a dance on the night. We used to go to the Rink, which is just off Park Lane, or the Bay Hotel, or the Seaburn Hotel. But the dance bands was the best. We used to hear the saxophones play, it was lovely. And they used to play the Paul Jones, and used to walk round in the middle of the dance floor. And if I saw a little fella, I used to run out the road because I wanted a tall fella. But it was lovely. Quick step, he'd go in the corner and he would jive and away. It was lovely ballroom dancing. You got to know everybody. And if there was a soldier there or a sailor, well, it made you life.
You spend a hard day at work and then you want to have some leisure time. So we would go to the pictures, go to a dance. The Rink was the favourite place. Everybody seemed to congregate at the Rink, big dance hall behind the Regal Cinema. They were good, and of course the 60s saw the couple of things happened in the 60s. For me, from my memory, we got a bubble car. Bubble cars came into vogue. The birth of rock and roll and the Beatles and a new music, a new Mercy beat, great stuff. And people had a more liberal attitude as well. And people had more leisure time. Really work where people used to think, oh, it's important to go to work and earn money and that. People seem to turn to like free living and the drugs came into it and they had a sort of a less, created less importance to work and thought more about leisure, how they could amuse themselves. In fact, if you were on the dole, okay, so what? You got enough money to look after you. And I think the National Health Service and those sort of things, people got money too easily out of work. So therefore they just didn't put so much effort into it. A different way of life came about.
The Rink remained a dance venue under different guises through the 1960s, and one by one many cinemas closed or became bingo halls after the advent of TV. But the appeal of football in the town continued unabated. Over 75,000 people watched the cup tie between Sunderland and Derby County in 1933. It was one of the heydays of Sunderland AFC. The League Championship in 1936 and the FA Cup in 1937. Footballers' wages, although better than most, were not star status as they are today. £8 per week in the season for the first-team players and £6 in the summer. Nevertheless, it was many boys' dream to play for Sunderland, and amateur football clubs drew many members. Richie Pitt was in the team who won the FA Cup for the second time this century in 1973.
The thing I remember was coming out the tunnel at the beginning of the game, and it's one of those moments when the hairs stand up on the back of your neck. The roar was just deafening, and the Sunderland fans were fantastic on the day. And the thing is about that, we were so much the underdogs that nobody expected us to win, so we had nothing to lose. We were totally relaxed. And when we saw Leeds on the TV being interviewed before the game, they were all stiff and straight and uptight and in suits, and we thought, oh, we've got a chance here. And as it turned out, we just did our best, and our best was good enough on the day. And when we got to Durham, we changed to an open-top bus, and there was 750,000 people on the streets to welcome us back. And I can't say enough about the supporters of Sunderland. They are absolutely fantastic. And even now, they're no different. You know, they turn up in the 40,000s every week, and it's Sunderland deserve to have a top 3 team because the supporters deserve it, and the supporters have been fantastic over the last 25 years.
The new Stadium of Light and promotion to the Premier League gladden the hearts of Sunderland fans at the end of the century. Skating was a popular sport in the 1920s and 30s, and Sunderland had its own rink behind the Regal Cinema. Athletics was also well supported. Choirs and amateur dramatics were thriving too. Some troupes were run by local churches and some were not, such as Sunderland Drama Club, which in the 1930s used the Victoria Hall for its productions and charged 2 and 6 admission. It still flies the banner of live theatre in Sunderland at the Royalty Theatre, presenting several plays and a pantomime every year. The Empire Theatre, a civic theatre since 1959, also continues to attract the public with a variety of concerts, pantomimes, ballet and so on. Of course, one form of entertainment which was technically free, before you bought your ice creams, paid for your donkey rides, hired your deck chair and so on, was a trip to the beach at Sunderland's twin resorts of Roker and Seaburn. Sea bathing, cafes, parks and shops and later a fairground, motorboat canal and public hall made the seaside an attraction for not only day trips but also for annual holidays. People from local towns and villages sometimes came and spent a week in one of the many boarding houses. The artist L.S. Lowry for many years came and spent a holiday in the Seaburn Hotel, now the Swallow Hotel, and painted many seascapes. Today, the seafront also sports amusement arcades and children's play areas. The park has many amenities, including a boating lake, and in recent years was one of the focal points of the illuminations, bringing back a popular event of the 1950s. Some other parks, such as Mowbray, Backhouse and Barnes Park, laid out in the 19th century, were another source of affordable entertainment. Recently, many people have been delighted to see the reintroduction of concerts from the bandstands. The library and museum services, so well established in Victorian times, have gone on from strength to strength, preserving in their wake valued old buildings, such as Monk Wearmouth Station, as well as providing a service in their own right. With the building of the new Library and Arts Centre in Fawcett Street in the 1990s, the museum has been able to extend itself into what was once the library part of the building. Many people feel the Library and Arts Centre is an example of modern design at its best. Sunderland, like every other part of Britain, felt deeply the impact of both world wars. 360 merchant ships and a number of destroyers were built on the Wear during the First World War. And in 1917, Sunderland's shipbuilding efforts were recognised by the visit of King George V and Queen Mary to Doxford's shipyard. The year before, Sunderland had experienced the war at first hand, when a Zeppelin dropped high explosives and incendiary bombs, killing 22 and injuring over 100. As in other places, women began to take up occupations usually reserved for men. In 1915, the first 10 tram conductresses were employed, and soon all the conductors were women. And there were many Sunderland men who marched away to fight, about 18,000, 10% of the population. It's estimated that 1/3 of them were killed or wounded. Local medical services were stretched to breaking point by casualties, and 5 large houses in the town were taken over and converted into hospitals. A war memorial in the form of an angelic winged victory was erected in 1922 and still stands in Mowbray Park. The Second World War, ironically, brought hope to many Wearsiders, for their industrial skills, so long redundant, were now urgently needed for the war effort. However, it was that importance as an industrial centre which put Sunderland right in the front line of the German bombing campaign. The town suffered 42 raids which caused damage and inflicted casualties, and was the most heavily bombed English town north of Hull. Local authorities had been planning for civil defence since 1935 and laid great stress on the threat of gas attacks. One Saturday in September 1938, between 10 a.m. and 7 p.m, about 50,000 people were trained in the use of gas masks at 22 fitting centres, mainly schools around Sunderland. By early 1939, the ARP were organised with headquarters in a large house in Tunstall Road. Initial plans for underground shelters were abandoned because of cost, and the town had to rely on trench shelters, basements, Morrison steel shelters and Anderson shelters. Despite the severity of the bombing, many Sunderland people adopted a fairly matter-of-fact attitude. Cinemas and theatres used to open their exits during air raid warnings to allow members of the audience to leave, but the show went on, and most people stayed. One incident remembered by many seems to epitomise the gritty blitz attitude of many Sunderland folk. One night, a bomb blew some wagon wheels out of the railway station, over the high station wall, and right through the window of Joseph's toy shop. Mr. Joseph proudly left the wheels in the window, accompanied by the defiant message, "To hell with Hitler, business as usual." Here the bombing was. Many people remember the destruction of Bin's store in 1941, but May 1943 is remembered as one of the worst periods, with many industrial premises, ship repairers, rope works and shipyards sustaining heavy damage. 153 people in and around these premises were killed in 2 nights, more than half the total wartime figure.
The sirens would go, and it was on my bicycle and back to the fire station, over the Alexander Bridge. And to do that with the guns firing and the shrapnel falling down like rain, and you could hear the shrapnel falling on the bridge, ping pong, and the same in the shipyard. It would ring like a bell ringing, you know. 60 bombers came over, and they dropped every kind of missile I could think of. I could see the flares falling from the bombers. They were lighting the way along the river. Arrived at the fire station, already men was leaving, calls coming in for help.
Massive rescue and demolition work continued for days. Over 500 houses were demolished, 2,000 seriously damaged, and over 17,000 needed a great deal of repair. Transport and water and sewerage supplies were disrupted. Throughout all this, the Sunderland Echo was very careful to be vague and guarded in its reporting, so as to give information to the German intelligence. Speaking of the Sunderland raids, it referred to a northeast coast town. Anxieties about bombing from the onset of war led to plans for the evacuation of children, expectant mothers and under 5s, and the walking disabled. Parents were left to make their own decisions about whether or not to have their children evacuated, and many simply couldn't face the parting. At first there were few air raids, and many withdrew their applications, thinking there was little danger. However, many evacuees did leave Sunderland for County Durham and North Yorkshire. Among them, Dorothy Hunter.
Plans had obviously been laid for the evacuation of most of the children in Sunderland, but particularly from Bede School. I was in the girls' school and my brother 2 years behind me in the boys' school. That week must have been horrendous for our parents and for all other parents, because we had 1 week to plan what we were going to take and what was going to happen. On the Sunday morning, the 10th of September, we were told that we were to walk to school, and our parents were to stay at the bottom of the bank that we called the Bede Bank. It was hard, and we all went into school, and I can't remember how long we stayed there, but eventually the girls all came down in twos, and it wasn't the whole school, it was just those girls who opted to be evacuated. We all walked down the bank, and we could see this mass of parents straddled right across the road and down the road, some of them crying, and it was dreadful. We turned round and walked up and along Barnes Park Road to Hilton Road, and then down Hilton Road to the station at Millfield, which no longer exists, and we were put on a train. We were told to take a change of clothing, and we all had tags which said Sun, S-U-N, 41. The girls, we were going to go to Richmond, and the boys were going to go to Northallerton, and that was even harder for my parents to come to terms with. We finally reached the station in Richmond. Quite excited, some of us were, but I think the younger ones were getting a bit tearful. And we got off the train in Richmond and walked across the bridge into the school yard. And there people were waiting. Obviously, there were people that we were going to stay with. And I were 14, and the others were all ages down as far as 11. And one by one, people were coming to say, you know, you come with me and stay with me. And my friend and I were taken by a very kindly old gentleman in his car to his home. They made us very welcome. I can't remember what emotions I felt then. It was partly excitement, partly fear of the unknown. But we did settle down.
For those remaining in Sunderland, one of the abiding memories, as well as the air raids, is of rationing and those endless queues.
But we used to have to stand in the queue. As I say, I had 2 green ration books because I was expected to eat. And sometimes you stood, and when you got to the front, there was nothing left. And everybody knew when you had a green book. They used to say, oh, look at her with a green book. It was awful. And then I was out one day at Fulham, and this lorry went past, and a great big onion fell off and rolled down the middle of the road. And I ran over and I was looking in case I got knocked down. And I put it under the blankets in the pram, and I could smell it when I got back to my sister's. And I said, me mother, smell that. She says, hey, why are you getting it? I said, it fell off the lorry. I said, I'll go back tomorrow and see if he comes back again, but he never did. So we had a big Portugal onion.
And there was, of course, always the fear and anxiety for the men away fighting. Men who had, as in the First World War, joined the Durham Light Infantry, or the Northumbrian Fusiliers, Royal or Merchant Navy, RAF or Marines. There was always the dread of the telegram. When peace was declared, the biggest crowd since Sunderland won the FA Cup in 1937 packed the central area of Fawcett Street.
All of a sudden, the all clear went. and we couldn't understand what it was all about. And people in the street were dancing and shouting and singing, and a mother came running into the school shrieking, "The war's over, the war's over." Well, I remember distinctly walking all the way from Hilton Road right to Grangetown, and the joy and the fun that was going on was just indescribable. All the buses stopped, all the trams stopped, everybody was hugging everybody else, irrespective of whether they knew them or whether they didn't know. All I wanted to do was to get home to my mum and dad, and it was quite something. The ships' hooters were going on the down the river, the pit sirens were going. It was just marvellous. And that was the end of the war. Oh, I remember, yes, some of the boys who lived in our street were in Japanese prisoner of war camp, which wasn't very nice. And I remember them, one of them coming home and the other didn't. But that was months and months and months after, because when the Japanese camps were taken over by the Allies, they put the lads onto a ship and took them home right the way around the world, right around America, so that they could feed them and make them look more presentable.
Although people often think first of Sunderland's economic problems when they review the century, in some way the quality of life has improved. The town became less isolated as dual carriageways were built to link Sunderland with the Durham motorway by 1969 and with Teesside by 1971. Many regretted, however, the diminishing role of the rail network. Trains no longer ran to Durham, and in order to reach London and the south, one had to change at Durham or Newcastle. And this is a town that once had a station just north of the river, Monk Wearmouth Station, and a town centre station with a north end and a south end. Since the 1960s, only the south end remains. For almost exactly half a century, the trams were the major mode of transport around the town. Electrified soon after 1900, speeded up and modernised in 1929, when it was mooted that motor buses should replace them altogether, and running a full service until 1950. Then they were gradually phased out until 1954, when the last tram in the northeast made its final run from the town hall to Seaburn and back to the Wheatsheaf depot. The bus services have undergone many changes of name, ownership, type and colour. Many will remember the navy blue and white livery of the Sunderland District omnibuses, the red of the Northern, and the grass green, later yellow, of the corporation buses. Mergers and takeovers have seen the demise of small companies like the Economic Bus Service, which ran from Park Lane along the seafront and to South Shields. Construction of a new bridge was begun in 1908, the Alexandra Bridge, to link industry on both sides of the river. The river too saw changes. In the 20s and 30s, a long, new deep water quay for general cargo, Corporation Quay, was constructed. It was provided with concrete warehouses and a row of electric cranes and greatly improved the river's facilities. However, as so often happens, in doing so, it saw the disappearance of many small wharves, old houses, workshops and taverns that so characterized the riverside. The same pattern of renovation and loss characterized the Borough Council's post-war housing programme. In 1945, the town needed over 12,000 houses to replace war-damaged or destroyed homes, and there was still some poor and overcrowded housing to clear. Some felt that clearance of old housing was pushed a bit over-enthusiastically. Much of the East End turned into wasteland, and it was a tightly knit community. People really did not want to leave. However, one can understand the council's determination to change the situation, evident from the 1951 census. 43% of households either shared or were entirely without piped water, and 52% had no fixed bath.
And these cottages that we lived in then were built for the workers on the shipyards. And we were sandwiched between two great shipyards, Sir James Laing's and William Duxford's. So you can imagine the dirt and the noise and what to put up with. The cottage was a 3-room cottage for 6 people. No facilities, no electricity, no inside water, no toilet. The toilet was in the backyard, which froze solid in the winter. The bath night was usually a Friday night. So a large tin bath was brought in from the backyard, placed in front of the fire, and there were large pans boiling on the fire with water. This poured into the bath tin, and probably 2 would be bathed in the same water. And even to save the hot water, when the bathing was over, the clothes were put in the bath tin to wash. Because I was a boy among the girls, and on Friday night I was chased outside by my father to get in the street and play. My sister was getting bathed. Those some nights was freezing cold. So I'd be tucked in the back bedroom somewhere out the road while they got bathed. And it was Dad and Mum's bath night. We were all chased out.
My first memory, I think, of my dad really was come from work. When he came from the pit black, which would have been 1930s. I remember running down the street to meet him come from work, and he's all black, you know. Because he used to come to the curry houses then, he used to get bathed in the bath in front of the fire. There were mainly a room downstairs, 2 rooms upstairs, bedrooms, and the kitchens were attached to the building themselves or anybody from the curry. And that's where you spend most of your time. You had your meals. Everything was done in that kitchen. The front room was kept as special.
One area of Sunderland became nationally famous in the late 60s and early 70s, however, for resisting plans to demolish large parts of it. This was Millfield. 80% of houses in parts of Millfield lacked or shared basic facilities. But it possessed an immensely strong community spirit, and, led by Norman Dennis, a sociology lecturer, eventually won the battle for rehabilitation and renovation instead of demolition. In the vast rehousing campaign that got underway just after the Second World War, the housing estates of Springwell and Thorney Close, followed by others such as Plains Farm and Pennywell, almost doubled the built-up area of Sunderland. Many multi-storey flats were also constructed in the East End, Monk Wearmouth and Gilly Law. As had been discovered everywhere, community life can never be quite the same in high-rise living, and the current trend is away from this style of home. In more recent developments, such as Doxford Park on the outskirts of Sunderland, a wide variety of low-rise housing has been provided. The town centre saw vast changes at the same time as the housing developments were taking place. Most notably, the demolition of the old town hall in Fawcett Street in 1971 and its replacement by the new town hall and civic, and the building of the shopping precinct in the town, recently renovated, covered in and named the Bridges. Many people welcomed the new shopping area, although they may have regretted the fact that Fawcett Street was no longer such a centre of the retail trade, but most were saddened by the demise of the town hall, with its clock tower that could be seen from most parts of the town. Many people remember features of the pre-war, pre-NHS, pre-penicillin Sunderland. Although these conditions contrast sharply with those of today, taken in its own context, the period between the wars was a time when overall public health in Sunderland actually improved. The death rate fell, the infant mortality rate fell. Deaths from disease such as bronchitis, TB and pneumonia were declining, and general malnutrition, with its associated conditions like rickets, became the exception rather than the rule. However, these were generalized improvements, and it's possible that certain districts were still badly disadvantaged in terms of health, owing to poor housing and environment in general. Their improvement was to wait until after World War II, whereas in the 1930s many other people to healthier conditions in council housing. New sewerage schemes were also introduced in the 1930s. WCs were provided to replace earth closets, and hospitals were built or extended. The Royal Infirmary and the General Hospital already existed, but new developments were the construction of the new Eye Infirmary and the Monk Wearmouth Hospital. Grindon Hall was also purchased and made into a sanatorium. The Royal Infirmary closed recently, and the General Hospital is known as Sunderland Royal Hospital, ever gaining new wings and facilities to serve the whole of the city. The foundations of state education in Sunderland were laid in the 19th century with the establishment of board schools, run by locally elected school boards, to supplement the work already done by voluntary schools, some of which were run by the various churches. The first board school in Sunderland was James William Street. When the board was wound up in 1902, it handed over to the LEA 18 large schools with over 21,000 scholars on their registers. The majority of these were elementary schools, but the forerunners of secondary schools, higher grade schools, had also been established, and these became the Bede Collegiate Schools in 1905. Bede Grammar Schools, boys and girls in separate schools, moved to new buildings on Durham Road in 1929. It's now part of City of Sunderland Further Education College.
The children came from very mixed homes. Beside the school there were the remains, that's all you can think that there were the remains of what were once very, very big houses owned by ship owners, men with good jobs who worked in the port, but they'd been allowed to deteriorate to an extent that they were really unlivable in. They were so poor. Some of them came to school and they were dirty because the water had been turned off in their houses, and they would wait until next door had gone to work and climbed over the wall to get washed. And it was cold water. And what can you do with cold water with no soap, and you can't wash your hair with cold water?
They were forever going to clinics. The school nurse was forever coming in and excluding them. And when the time came that these people had to be moved from these atrocious buildings, it was sad. They didn't want to go. They had the choice of going to west of the town, north of the river, and many of them did. After that, I don't know what happened because the school closed, and that was the end of Hendon. It was very, very sad.
In 1963, the first Sunderland Comprehensive School was opened, Hilton Red House. Other purpose-built comprehensive schools soon followed, such as Pennywell, Monk Wearmouth and Thornhill. In the early years of the century, a constable's lot constituted a duty of at least 12 to 16 hours, 7 days a week, with 1 day off a month, if he was lucky. However, at one time there was an annual policeman's outing. Who stayed behind to keep order? Their boots were often a source of complaint. Retiring policemen's boots were usually recycled for new recruits. They carried an oil lamp attached to their belts, useful for warming the hands on night duty. Their breaks were spent in shop doorways, and the reserve constable would leave at an appointed time carrying cans of tea under his cape to distribute to his colleagues. This took some time, so the cup that cheers was frequently cold. The East End had a reputation for being rough and rowdy, so constables always worked in pairs. Bodelwell Lane housed the lockup for the East End, and prisoners detained there were next handcuffed, chained together, and marched up High Street to headquarters, or carried on a barrow owned by a local grocer if they were too drunk to walk. Jim Sneddon recalls his experiences of policing in the post-war years.
I was posted down to the Hendon area, which was like what was called Hendon Road. On a night time, you could find that on a very warm night, you could walk round the streets and many of the people were sitting on the doorsteps. You used to just chat to them there, and you'd find out, you know, half past 1, 2 o'clock in the morning, and they'd be sitting there, they would say quite warm, and you'd chat to them and you'd find out what was going on locally round about. 10 o'clock was the turning out times for the pubs. So at 10 o'clock night shift, you would be on one side of the street, the beat man on that side would be there, and you'd wait for them coming out. Now when they came out, there'd be quite a congregation. You'd give them about 10 minutes, quarter of an hour, and then you'd just go across and say, come on lads, it's time you're on your way. And they would go, no bother. But you had your day like this down there, just the same. Some of them, they liked the beer. They were always into trouble, and they liked a bit of a fight now and again. But on the whole, they were quite decent people when you got to know them.
Sunderland has witnessed, experienced and had to adapt to the great changes which have taken place all over the country this century. Some have been hard to absorb. Some have been for the better, for the greater well-being of Sunderland people. And there's a certain resilience and dry humour in Sunderland people which will take them forward into the 21st century. Having faced the challenges of the past, they'll be prepared to meet the changes, challenges and opportunities of the future.